Hi everyone, I'm Rubina.
And I'm Layla.
Welcome back to our channel, Nutrition Unpacked,
where we try out diets so you don't have to.
We're trying out the vegetarian diet.
Ooh.
How are you feeling about that?
Honestly, I'm pretty excited because I think the vegetarian diet is something that I've wanted to try a bunch of times and I just haven't done it.
I think the word vegetarian is something, we've all heard, we probably all used it. I don't think that there's necessarily one take on the vegetarian diet. There's actually a lot of different versions of how people want to approach vegetarianism.
It's actually a big issue in the literature as well. Is like when you see studies that say like vegetarian diet this, it can mean so many different things. And if you go out on the street and talk to someone who says they're following a vegetarian diet, that can also mean so many different things. You have things like the plant-based diet, which also means a lot of different things. Pescatarians, ovo-lacto-vegetarians, ovo-vegetarians, lacto-vegetarians, vegans, and then there's some people who say that you can only be a vegan if you're coming at it from like an ethical standpoint. So vegetarian is like a big word and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
The most commonly accepted definition of it is like people that don't necessarily eat like the meat or flesh of animals, but they can still eat things like dairy and eggs and even honey, which is I think how we're going to approach the vegetarian diet as well.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, vegetarianism actually has a really long history. In parts of the world, it's actually very intricately tied to religious or spiritual beliefs. For example, in India, vegetarianism is actually a really big part of Hinduism and Jainism, belief systems that have these philosophies of not doing any harm and non-violence, that type of philosophy extending beyond humans to non-human animals.
These practices of vegetarianism in different parts of the world go back thousands of years. Places like China, where with Buddhism, there was a lot of vegetarian diets that were followed. And interestingly, a lot of the products that we currently see for vegetarian diets, like tofu, seitan, cognac, actually have origins within the Chinese Buddhist culture.
In the Western context, it seems like the idea of vegetarian lifestyles was introduced more in the 18th, 19th century. It came at it more from a lens of health, like mitigating disease or promoting health, as opposed to those other places where there might be more of a spiritual or religious undertone to it.
What's really interesting is, I don't know if you remember grade, 9 math? Was it grade? I think it was earlier than that. I don't know when it was. But you remember Pythagoras, known for our Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. He was also known for potentially being a vegetarian. And the first word for vegetarian in English was Pythagoreans in relation to Pythagoras.
They never taught us that in math class.
No, they didn't.
Coming back to the present, it seems like a lot more people have been interested in pursuing at least plant-based lifestyle, the idea of being flexitarian, maybe giving up animal products altogether. For some people, it might be from a health perspective. I think it's largely coming from kind of ethical or environmental concerns as well.
In response to that, we've seen industry have a lot more products. I didn't grow up really vegetarian, but when I thought of like what products were out there for vegetarians, it was like tofurky, tofu, and that was it. But now when you go through the grocery store, you have plant-based meats, so all like the Impossible Burgers and the Beyond Meats. And not only are those available in the grocery stores, they're actually even available in restaurants.
Even 10-20 years ago, you go to most restaurants and there might be like one vegetarian and or vegan option, probably just like a boring salad or something. But now it's like at least you have a handful of options, and then like other options, it's like you could make substitutions to make vegetarian or vegan. So it's really awesome that it is maybe becoming more of a realistic or feasible lifestyle. With this, recent increase or movement towards plant-based lifestyles, we're seeing that more and more people are identifying as vegetarian or vegan. Depending on the survey, we're seeing ranges from between 5 to 10% of the population identifying as such.
Which is a lot more than I would think from, I guess, like my circles.
When we were in school, they said like 1 to 2%. Even though the majority of people in the North American context are not vegetarian or vegan, I do think that there's a general conception that being vegetarian or plant-based is healthier. Now, is that actually true? What's wonderful is that there's actually so much research on vegetarianism and its possible links to various disease states or even the mediating biomarkers.
When we look at vegetarian diets, we see that they're associated with low risk of certain chronic diseases like diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease.
There are even clinical trials that show that people that go on a vegetarian diet, it could be used as a way to lose weight.
There's a few different ways by which this is shown to work. Vegetarian diets can reduce blood pressure, blood lipids, and both of those things can have impacts for your risk of things like cardiovascular disease. They can reduce inflammation, immune responses in the body, and those are actually associated with a lot of chronic diseases, things like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. There's maybe a few different reasons why we see this. Generally, when you look at people who are on vegetarian diets, a lot of times they're a little bit more cognizant of what they're eating. So we see people who are vegetarian eating more in line with, let's say, the Canada's Food Guide.
And when we say healthier, what we mean is people that eat vegetarian diets, they might just be getting in more fiber, more potassium, more polyphenols, taking in less saturated fats as well. And all of those changes are associated with positive health outcomes. There's a lot of research that seems to really show that vegetarianism might be a health promoting way to live. I would say there are some limitations to the research. A lot of them are observational in nature. So there could be, a plethora of other variables that might be contributing to those effects, even though we can kind of see the mechanisms that might be leading to those positive health outcomes. Another thing to be mentioned at the beginning, there's so many versions or takes on what vegetarianism could look like. Maybe being ovo-vegetarian is better than ovo-lacto-vegetarian. I think it's difficult to really tease out those nuances at this point.
And then you also have the fact that, as we mentioned, vegetarianism is oftentimes like almost a cultural or a religious thing. One group of people that's really been studied for their vegetarian diet are Seventh-day Adventists. There's been a lot of conclusions that are made, but if you're looking at a group of people all have like the same religious beliefs, they might live in the same kind of communities, it's hard to really say, oh, the effect was the vegetarian diet, when it could have been many, many other things.
So all that being said, is there any reason why being a vegetarian could actually be harmful to your health? Research in those that do vegetarian diets do show that vegetarians might have lower bone mineral density and possibly lower levels of iron in their blood as well.
I know with like the advent of like the carnivore, paleo, whatever, there's been like almost like a counter movement to the plant-based movement being like, plants are bad for you. And like,
look, people who are on vegetarian diets have more depression.
When you look into it, you get a lot of really mixed results for when you're looking at vegetarian diets and depression. Some studies show that there is a correlation, some studies show that there isn't a correlation, and some studies show there's actually benefits of vegetarian diets for depression. So I think it's hard when you're looking at these population-based studies to make these like sweeping claims, and I think that a lot of these people who are like vegetarian diets can't be healthy are really kind of cherry picking the data that they want to use to support that. With that in mind, when we talked about bone mineral density and iron status, that's not super surprising. Meat is a great source of many, many nutrients, and it can sometimes be hard if you're not planning things out properly to get those in. For example, type of iron that's in meat is better absorbed. We also have things like protein, B12, calcium, zinc, and iodine and selenium that are found in higher quantities in meat, and that's kind of the main source. So if you're not really like thinking about your diet, it is possible that you might end up with a deficiency or just not getting adequate amounts of those.
So over the next 2 weeks, we are going to take on the vegetarian diet and share all of our learnings and our tricks and tips to make sure that you can still have a wonderfully, beautifully nourishing diet while not eating animal meat. To help us with that process, we're actually going to be interviewing my sister. She's been a vegetarian since she was in high school, so we're going to get all of her best advice for us as well.
I'm very, very excited to meet her, hear all of her expertise on how she's navigated doing the vegetarian diet for, a couple decades now?
I think like almost 2 decades,
Wow.
or it might be actually 2 decades.
Oh.
Yeah, we'll get the actual number from her.
I am so excited to announce our expert, Valentina Amalraj.
My sister.
I'm excited to make my YouTube debut today.
So the reason that we have you on is because you've been a vegetarian for a really, really long time, and we're just going to be starting our vegetarian 2-week vegetarian journey, and we want to get all the insights from an expert. Tell us when you became a vegetarian and why.
I became a vegetarian when I was in grade 10, so I guess 16 years old, and I'm now 35, so I guess about 20 years ago. I was mostly motivated by interest in animal welfare, you could say. I'd become very concerned about large-scale animal farming and was in a part of the world where that was the only meat that was accessible. That was the driver. I think it helped that my family only ate meat about once a week anyway, so it wasn't a huge shift.
Yeah, I think it's really relatable for a lot of people is that, especially with social media, we're a little bit more visible to it is the way that animals are treated. You know, as you said, in this part of the world, really most of your options for meat are from large scale farms where animal welfare isn't really thought about. But, you know, thinking 20 years ago, it probably wasn't on the front of a lot of people's minds.
Because I think a lot of people like watch those documentaries or see those things and have like maybe a moment of feeling inspired to want to make change. But you've actually like stuck with it for an impressive amount of time.
There was one when I was even younger than that, probably just in my preteens. So we used to live in the Middle East, and my dad would always go to this chicken store to buy chicken, and I would keep begging my dad to take me in, and he'd keep telling me, no, there's just no way. If you go in, you'll never eat meat again. I just finally clawed my way in, and I was just really shocked because they, you know, you pick your chicken and they slaughter it for you, and it just never left my mind.
I don't think they ever had a problem with me going in. I feel like I saw that many times.
Ravina, yours were the tougher one. You had a tougher spirit. You could handle it.
It's a classic story of like the first child versus the second.
Yeah.
Well, we'd love to hear, especially since you've been a vegetarian for so long. Are there any like misconceptions about vegetarianism, or like are there things that people say to you that you're always having to combat?
There are a few things, and I think it's changed a lot over time. I'd say initially there were just a lot of questions about, well, what do you eat? And like, how do you feel full? And how do you get your protein? But now I find that people assume it's cultural often. Like people assume often that, oh, well, you must come from a vegetarian family. And I often find that when I tell people I'm vegetarian, I immediately say now, oh, but my family isn't. It wasn't. You know, it was just something I did when I was like...
You're like, I want credit for this.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's different judgments, right? I think when people see someone doing something for cultural reasons, very different judgments than like someone choosing something. I think now, I would say the biggest misconception is people think you love salads. I find that's like an ongoing thing where it's like, oh, okay, you're vegetarian. Salads are probably like your favorite thing.
Which is funny because there's so many plant-based foods that aren't salads, but I think within the Western context, it's just that it's like vegetarian, vegetables, you like salad. So that's it. It's interesting.
And I come from a culture where salad eating is not really a thing, so I don't mind salads, but it's very far from my favorite way to eat vegetables.
When people decide to become vegetarian, I do think sometimes it's just removing the meat of the meal. And maybe not anymore, but I feel like that's maybe how it was done before. Like, I don't know if like beans and legumes are like coming to mind, you know?
I used to always tell people when I'd go to their places that like, oh, I'll eat fish, even though I really never wanted to.
Do you feel like that's changed recently?
Yes, for sure. I don't tell people that anymore. Most people have like one vegetarian meal that they're comfortable with in their repertoire now. So it's, yeah, I do ask, and I pretty much always when I go to someone's place will say like, oh, I'm totally okay just having like sides, you don't have to. But it's been pretty consistent the last few years that people are like, oh no, I know how to make this one thing and I'm gonna make that for you.
Well, speaking of, people's repertoire growing to incorporate more plant-based meals, like what are your thoughts on like recent trends like plant-based or flexitarian or like meatless Mondays, like that kind of thing? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's good. I think it's good that people are eating more variety and like trying to see what it's like. It's definitely easier for someone that's vegetarian if other people have had the experience. I've always felt like maybe you'd probably get better food if you just like turn to different like diets that already exist and borrow vegetarian dishes from them than like I think the current tendency to sort of like mix and match like random ingredients. Like I feel like, I don't know, I always think like if people have been eating a specific dish for a longer time, it's more likely to like have that balance of like what you need to like absorb different things and all of that. So instead of like, you have like spot of spaghetti and instead of the beef, I'm going to just throw in some lentils. I think it's totally fine. And I do that. I think everyone does that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think both from like a flavor perspective, and I think probably also from a health perspective, you're better off like looking at like dishes that have existed for forever that were vegetarian in nature. I think they generally taste better, and I think probably they're also just, when people have eaten something for a long time, it's probably just nutritionally a more sensible dish.
Honestly, I think that's a really good point, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think that in our cultural context, it's kind of like, oh, we're like the first people doing basically anything. And, we forget that there's so many different cultures that have been having vegetarian and vegan diets for thousands of years that we can kind of pull from. And as you said, have dishes that are a little bit tastier and a little bit more nutritionally balanced, because, your example of a pasta sauce where people might replace the meat with chickpeas, but they might just like not replace it with anything at all.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't going to provide you all, the protein and amino acids and things that you might need. And then that's where people might get the wrong idea about vegetarian diets and be like, oh, well, there's no way you can get your protein in. There's no way you can feel full. There's no way you can get enough nutrition. How has being a vegetarian influenced your social interactions? And have there been any difficulties with that? How have you navigated that? And, have things changed in the past 2 decades that you've been doing this?
I think for sure things have changed. I don't think people, like I said, it's not considered an oddity. I feel like now if you say you're vegan, then you get like kind of a lot more, people get very concerned for you. But I think with vegetarian, people are like, okay. Now I find it's very typical for people to actually tell me that they've tried vegetarianism at some point in my life. I feel like almost like 1 in 3 people are like, oh, I was vegetarian for a year and then I was just exhausted all the time, so I stopped, or my iron just whatever, or different experiences. Because I have a 3-year-old toddler, it's something a lot of people have asked me in terms of like, oh, are you feeding him meat, or like, are you making the decision for him? And I've always found that interesting, because it's like you're making a decision either
Interesting way of phrasing it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's as someone that became vegetarian, like I would have loved to have never eaten meat in my whole life. So I think either way you're making a decision. So I feel like over the last 20 years, that general concern of are you getting enough protein has gone away. I don't think anyone asks me like, are you getting protein? But yeah, I think when you have specialized events or like a child, there's still that concern.
As society's views have kind of changed and maybe people are becoming more open to the idea of plant-based eating, has the way you're eating changed at all?
When I became a vegetarian, I'd never eaten a hot dog, and for some reason I just had this really deep fantasy about what a hot dog is like. Like in romantic comedies, like when they're trying to show that these couples very chill and comfortable, they have to go get a hot dog. It's like a trope almost. I just always had...
Especially if it's set in New York.
Yeah. It's set in New York, exactly. And like to this day, like if I see a hot dog stand and they have veggie dogs, I have to get it. And every single time I'm like, oh, why should I do this? So that was something for a long time that I was like, oh, I wish I could have a hot dog. But yeah, it's changed in that sort of event-specific things where I feel like, oh, okay, like I can have that. And of course, for cooking, sometimes it is easier to have one of those meat alternative options. Other than that, it hasn't changed much, other than I feel like now veganism is so accessible, and I feel like anyone that's vegetarian, you're always, I think, a wannabe vegan. At least for me, I would say I'm definitely a wannabe vegan that just can't make it.
Well, what's holding you back? Is there some animal product that you're having a harder time letting go of?
I'm having a very hard time letting go of chai. That's like pretty much the sum total of it. Like I can do without yogurt. I don't eat eggs really so much anymore anyway. The non-dairy milks just don't do well with chai in my experience so far, but I'm still figuring it out.
Vegan chai.
So that's it. That's the one thing that's preventing you from being vegan. A little bit of dairy milk. What advice would you give to someone that wants to transition into vegetarianism?
For someone that wants to transition, I would just say don't put pressure on yourself. And like I feel like every meal that you know, if this is something you desire, like every meal that you're eating without animal product or without meat is like, you know, a meal. Like you've achieved your goal for that meal, and I think it's better to just sort of do it meal by meal, and like you can always change your mind. The best advice is to turn to other ethnic cuisines and diets that you're maybe not familiar with to look for recipes. I think they tend to be more satisfying and more wholesome as a product than just replacing individual products.
Like moving away from all or nothing thinking, and then also don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel. Like, could you ever see yourself not being a vegetarian?
Well, you know how they're doing this like growing meat in the lab thing? I like the idea of using meat as a flavor enhancer, which I think is actually the way everyone should be using meat ideally, if I was creating a world with my little hands, which I'm not. But other than that, I think I've gotten so used to it, and I think at a certain point you're just like your interest in it diminishes, and like every now and then, like if, you know, something's going to get thrown out in our house, I will eat it, and it's very affirming, I find, because it happens once every couple of months, and every single time I have this thought of like, it really was not that tasty. Like, even though everyone at the table was like, this is so delicious, I'm like, I don't know if your own like taste buds change or what it is, but I'm always reminded like all the time, like I'm not really missing out on as much as other people feel like I am.
Are there any like either restaurants in Toronto / the GTA, or like cookbooks or like websites or like anything, any resources that people could access that you would recommend?
I know Planta everyone knows about, but I'll mention Planta because I was just there recently. There's a restaurant in my neighborhood called Udupi, which is a South Indian vegetarian restaurant, and it's delicious. But like I said, I think with like the thrust of what I've said earlier, like oftentimes, unless it's a really good vegetarian restaurant, I would say like going to like a Mexican restaurant and ordering like a bean-based dish might be more satisfying. Or even like, I love sushi and like I'm a vegetarian, so like tempura and like avocado rolls, like I often find that more satisfying. But well, good luck with the rest of your video, and good luck with the 4 weeks. I'm looking forward to seeing the video.
I'm ready. How do you feel?
Ready. I feel ready. I actually don't know if it's gonna be a huge change to my life. I mean, I definitely have like chicken or something like at least once a day, but I think I can handle it. Just like a little peek behind the curtain or whatever. Like, we're planning on doing 2 weeks of vegetarian and then taking it up a notch and doing 2 weeks of vegan. So I'm a little bit more nervous about that, to be totally honest.
That will definitely be the bigger change. Breakfast and lunch won't really be affected.
Yeah.
Dinner might be a little, but I also do like beans.
I'm excited to try new recipes and stuff as well.
Me too.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's the best thing about this.
Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you do plant-based anything, any version of it, and you have tips for us, feel free to tell us in the comments. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. I don't know if I told you to subscribe, but please subscribe. And follow us on Instagram and TikTok.
Thanks for watching. Bye.